In the previous presentation on the catapult's football movement analysis, we looked at the rationale as to why we developed this particular function. In this, the second in this series, we're actually going to look at what constitutes this football movement analysis algorithm. Now, just in the first place, it's worth recapping on the challenge that we faced in developing the algorithm. And the first thing is that we'd identified that there was a gap in the physical performance measures that were being reported to represent the demands of soccer match play and training. And so in developing the algorithm, we applied two underlying conditions. So the first one was that the data that informs the algorithm will be inertial sensor derived only. And then secondly, and probably most importantly, is that we wanted the output from this particular process to be something that sits as comfortably as possible with coaches and athletes. So the outcome then, from the work that the data science team at Catapult have undertaken, is we call it the football movement analysis. And the way that it works is at any point in time in football training or in matches, a player will occupy one of these 6 movement categories. And we're going to break it down into 1-second segments. So if we have 10 minutes worth of training activity, then there will be 600 of these 1-second segments, and at any point in time the players will be in one of these categories. Now, it could be that they stay in the category for a period of time, and so what we'll create is a kind of a cluster of activity, but we're not going beyond this. And this is in order that we can actually have conversations with coaches and with players that are meaningful to them. So here you can see the 6 categories are very low intensity work, and then there are 2 of the more linear running based categories. We've got medium intensity and high intensity running activity. And then we've got these 2 new categories, if you like, which better represent the mechanical or dynamic aspects of the sport. And these are at medium and high intensity. Now, just to give basic descriptions of each of these, we can see that the very low intensity category is almost when players are static. So it's standing like movements. As distinct from low intensity activity, which are your walking based movements, and then anything that does involve what we'll call meaningful work will fall into one of the remaining 4 categories. So medium intensity running is steady state jogging or running light movements, and high intensity running, steady state high speed running light movements. But these are predominantly the linear component, which we talked about in the previous presentation. And then for the 2 new ones, we've got medium intensity dynamic work, which is turning, changes of direction, but it also includes linear accelerations and decelerations because they themselves are dynamic. There's change taking place. And then similarly, for the higher intensity dynamic work, it's the same sort of movements, but they're just that little bit more intensive. Apply a little bit of science to this then, and the thing that differentiates between low, medium and high intensity work is the instantaneous player load associated with it. And what you can see here is that we've set thresholds at 0.2 arbitrary units, 1 arbitrary unit, and 1.7 arbitrary units. And then the other differentiator is that which demarcates between the running-based activity and the dynamic activity. And that's built around the level of variance in accelerometer data in the side and the forward planes. So this is the basis of the model. We've got some science in there, but that doesn't necessarily need to be anything that informs any conversations with coaches and players. Let's look at this practically, and what we've got here is match analysis profiles from 31 players during 64 games. So an awful lot of observations here, and what we can see is that there is a certain amount of time spent in each of these 6 zones. Now, the first thing we see is something that we do know anyway about the way that football is played, and we have close to 65% of the time is spent doing very little, either in low intensity or very low intensity activity. But then the remainder of the time is interesting. We've got a roughly equivalent time that's spent performing either dynamic or linear based activity. And if we look at the green here, the running based activity, the linear stuff that tends to be our go-to metrics, medium intensity work is about 15% of the time, and only 2% of the time is spent performing linear high intensity locomotive movements. Now that's a little bit different to the breakdown on the dynamic activities, where we've got roughly equivalent overall time spent in dynamic work to running work, but the breakdown is 9% and 8% for medium and high intensity work respectively. So there's the starting point where we begin to look at how match profiles might look using this new approach. I'm just going to present one chart here which represents a day's training with an English Premier League club, and what we're looking at is the time in seconds spent in each of these 4 meaningful periods of work. So working from the bottom up, we've got the light green is medium intensity linear work, then the dark green high intensity linear or running work, and then we've got the pink there, which is medium intensity non-linear or mechanical work, dynamic work, and the brown, which is high intensity dynamic work. And here we've got 9 different drills, all of which have their own profile and their own identity. And this is training drills, training activity. And the one thing that's immediately obvious is there's a high proportion of this meaningful work is performed in the medium and high intensity non-linear dynamic categories. And we'd argue that these pieces of work here currently go under the radar a little bit. And the real interesting drill for me is drill B, where you see that the vast majority of meaningful work is the dynamic work. Now, if we were to look at purely the linear metrics that tend to be our go-to metrics, this would be one of the least demanding drills that we would see within any kind of report. But when we add on the top of that the mechanical, dynamic or non-linear work, this is actually the 3rd most demanding of the drills that are performed in this training session. So what we're able to do then is, by adding this dynamic or mechanical algorithm on the football movement analysis approach, we can paint a totally different picture to that we're currently getting in football training. Obviously, that's a very, very brief overview of the football movement analysis. There's an email address there if anybody has any questions, or for sure, via the Catapult community, there's the opportunity to raise them with any one of the team of sports scientists at Catapult.